So today's lesson is Introduction to Nervous System. First, if we look at the objectives, we have to learn to describe the general arrangement of the nervous system and nervous tissue, describe the arrangement of a typical spinal nerve, describe the segmental supply of the body wall, describe the neurovascular plane, explain the segmental innervation of the skin and muscles, that's the dermatomes and the myotomes, and explain how limb plexuses form. When you look at the general arrangement of the nervous system and nervous tissue, we will look at the methods of classification about the neuron, the neuroglia, the synapse, the meninges, and the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So when we talk about the nervous system, it's a network of neurons and it's used to communicate with the environment. When we take communication within the body, two systems are mainly involved. One is the nervous system and the other is the endocrine system. The nervous system is usually quick and you get an immediate response. And the endocrine system is usually slow and more prolonged. So today we are going to talk about the nervous system. And this environment we talk about, it can be external and internal. The external stimuli are the external sensations, touch, pain, and also vision, hearing, all those things. When you take the internal environment, we talk about the internal condition of the body. Things like the blood pressure, the carbon dioxide concentration, things like that. So the nervous system receives information from the sensory organs, processes and modulates them, and sends commands to the body. So when you take the nervous system, it receives information from the external environment and the internal environment, and it sends out information. This can be voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary movements are basically the skeletal muscle movements. Walking, talking, holding something, all the skeletal muscle movements. And the involuntary activities are controlling of your blood pressure, the heart rate, your gut movements, the bowel movements, all those things are the involuntary movements. When we classify the nervous system, we can classify it into mainly two sections, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system mainly consists of the brain and the spinal cord, right? You have the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the nerves which leave the central nervous system and communicates with the other parts of the body. From the brain and the brain stem, on the upper part, you have the cranial nerves coming out, and from the spinal cord, you have the spinal nerves. Then the whole nervous system can be again divided into a somatic component and an autonomic component. The somatic component is the voluntary part, the skeletal muscle movements. The autonomic component is the involuntary part. As we said before, the blood pressure, heart rate, and things like that. Now we come to the neuron. The neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system, and it consists of a nerve cell body and its processors. So you have the nerve cell body, and you have small, this is a typical spine, typical nerve, right? So you have processes coming from it. Usually you have short processes called dendrites. These are dendrites. And a long process called the axon. This dendrite receives information from sensory organs. You receive information, or other nerves. You receive information into the nerve from these dendrites, and you give out information through the axon. This can branch and have many terminal ends. There's a large nucleus in the cell body. And various minor things you can learn in histology, right? When you take the axon, it is covered by another type of cell. Does anybody know what the name of these cells are?
Schwann cells.
Yes, the Schwann cells or the neurolemocytes. So these also have a nucleus and they are separate cells. So if you look at a cross section like this, and if this is the axon, the Schwann cells are wrapped around it. Like this. The Schwann cells are wrapped around. We have a nucleus here. And between these surfaces, you have a substance called myelin. It's a lipid and it's a whitish in color. So this myelin facilitates quick movement of the impulses traveling through these axons. So the nerves with these Schwann cells wrapped around are called myelinated nerves. But not all the cells are myelinated. So unmyelinated nerves can be seen like this. And the Schwann cells, the nerves are just embedded in like this, just covered like this, without the typical this wrapping around structure. So these spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. So those are the main parts. Here you can see a picture of the neuron with the nucleus, cell body, dendrites, axon and axon terminus with the myelin sheaths. And there are a few different types of neurons. Here you have a bipolar neuron, in which on one side you have a dendrite and on one side an axon. So usually you find this within the spinal cord as interneurons. And then you have unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neurons. These you have a dendrite with the information coming in from one side, and you have a common stem. You have the axon leaving it, which gives out information. Then you have the multipolar neuron with several dendrites and one long axon. And then you have pyramidal cells with the network of dendrites like this. So these are found usually within the brain. Then about neuroglia. Neuroglia are supportive cells of the nervous system. They are usually found surrounding the nerve cells. So you already know about the Schwann cells. Then when you take the peripheral nervous system, other than the Schwann cells, you have satellite cells. And satellite cells are cells which surround the cell body, and they provide a chemical support, metabolites, and those things control the internal environment. They just surround the cell bodies like this. When you take the central nervous system, again you have a few types of supportive cells or neuroglia. If you take oligodendrocytes, if you take two nerve cells like this, which are within the brain, you have oligodendrocytes between them, right? And these extend processes to the nerve cells like this, and from the ends you have the processes extending out like this and wrapping around the axons. So these have the same function as Schwann cells. Within the central nervous system, these serve the purpose of the Schwann cells. These are the oligodendrocytes. Then the astrocytes. What is this? Astrocytes are star-shaped. So you have a central part, and you have again processes extending, and from then you have food processes which extend like this, and these are situated along the blood vessels which supply the brain. This is a blood vessel or capillaries. The smallest blood vessel is the capillary, and the astrocytes have food processes which cover these capillaries. So the substances in the blood, the oxygen and the nutrients, everything has to pass the capillary wall cells as well as the food process of the astrocyte to reach the brain substance. So this acts like a barrier to prevent other toxins and unnecessary material entering the brain. So this acts as a barrier, and it's called the blood-brain barrier. So this is the function of the astrocytes. Then we have the microglia. Microglia are modified macrophages. So macrophages are a type of white blood cells. What is the main function of the white blood cells?
Defense.
Defense, yes, defense against microorganisms and foreign bodies. So these microglia within the brain, they have a defensive action. So what they do is, if there is any foreign substance, they take it up, they extend their food processes and take this into the cell and digest it, right? So if these are foreign material, this cell will digest them. And then you have the ependymal cells. These lie in the internal ventricle system. So if you look at the brain in a coronal section, so I hope all of you know what a coronal section is. And so it's just if you this is the face. So if you cut the body like this is a coronal section, right? This is the front, right? The nose and the mouth. If you cut in a direction in this manner, it gives a coronal section. So if you look at the brain in a coronal section, you have spaces within it. These are called ventricles, right? And they produce substance called CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. These ependymal cells line these ventricles and produce the CSF. These are the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. And here you can see the oligodendrocytes. You can see them nicely wrapping around the cells. Right? Then you have the astrocytes, the microglia, and the ependymal cells. And then if we talk about the synapse, it is the connection between two nerves. So if you draw, you have one nerve ending here. This is an end of an axon, and you have the dendrites of another cell. So when an impulse travels through this axon, when it reaches the end of the axon, it has small vesicles with the substance called neurotransmitters. So when the impulse reaches here, it will stimulate these vesicles to come to this surface, the terminal end, and release this neurotransmitter. And these dendrites have receptors. These receptors receive this neurotransmitter and convert this chemical reaction into an impulse. And this impulse will be carried to the next nerve. So here you have a picture of a synapse. Here the neural impulse travels from this nerve through the axon and terminal ends to the next one. Here from the dendrites you receive the impulse to the next neuron. Here you have the axon terminal. The space between the two nerves are called the synaptic cleft. And you have the receptor sites here. So this is a synapse, a connection between two neurons. Now we come to the meninges. Meninges are membranes that cover the brain and the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. You have three coverings: the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. So if you look at the brain, again, if you take a coronal section, you have the pia mater, which is closely covering the brain, and then outside it, you have the arachnoid matter. And from this arachnoid matter, you have a web-like things extending into the pia mater. And arachnoid means spider, right? So it's called arachnoid matter because of this substance, and this substance looks like a spider's web. So it's called the arachnoid matter. And outside, covering everything, you have the dura mater. The dura mater. Then, if we take a closer look at the central nervous system, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and consists of neurons and the supportive cells, the neuroglia. It's organized as gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the other collections of cell bodies. Cell bodies are usually found together, and in the brain, it's found on the outer surface in these regions. Right? And on the spinal cord, it's arranged in the middle area in a H-shaped manner, in this. So here in these areas, you have the cell bodies. And the white matter, these areas contain nerve fibers, the axons. Okay? The axons of the cell bodies are found in these white regions. Then if you look at the brain, you can again divide it into many parts. Okay? You mainly have the cerebrum, the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the brain stem can again be divided into three: the midbrain, pons, and medulla. If you look at the cerebrum, it's the main part, right? You have different lobes, different parts. So, if you look at the picture like this, you can see this. The different parts are given different names. So you have the frontal lobe in the front, the parietal lobes on the side, occipital lobe on the back, and temporal lobe on the lateral aspects. Then you have, if you look at the brain surface, it's thrown into many folds. Like this, it's thrown into many folds. And these outer parts, these extensions are called gyri. And these folds are called sulci. And you have some deep sulcuses, deep sulci, which are called fissures. So here you have the lateral sulcus, and these help divide the lobes into their different parts. So here you have the central sulcus dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And here you have the lateral sulcus separating the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal lobes. And if you look at the medial view, if you cut the brain in half and look at the internal aspect, you can see the parietal occipital sulcus here, which separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. And each of these areas have different functions. So there are many functions in all the different areas. If we talk about a few, when you look at the central sulcus in front, in the frontal lobe, in this area you have the motor cortex, which controls voluntary skeletal muscle activity, and behind it you have the somatosensory cortex, responsible for sensations of the body. In the temporal lobe, you have smell and hearing, and in the occipital lobe, you have visual sensations. And then, if we talk about commissural fibers or connections between the different parts of the brain, so you have different areas, different types of these fibers. Within the same side of the brain, you have association fibers like this. And then connecting the two halves of the brain, you have the commissural fibers. And connecting the brain to the spinal cord, you have the projection fibers. And if you take within the brain, there are many different small parts called hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, basal ganglia. These things you will learn in neuroanatomy. Just know that there are areas like this in the brain as well. Then you have the brain stem. The most superior part is the midbrain. Then you have the pons between the midbrain and the medulla. These parts relay the nerves from the body to the brain. Okay? Then you have the medulla oblongata, which is the which connects the brainstem to the spinal cord. So within this brainstem, you have again different collections of cell bodies called nuclei. We'll talk about it later on. So when you take the medulla oblongata, you have few vital centers within it, like the respiratory center, cardiac center, and vasomotor center. So these centers are responsible for controlling involuntary areas of your body, like your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, heart rate, things like that. And then you have the cerebellum, which is this part behind your brain and the brainstem. So its function is for coordination and your posture and maintaining your balance. Here again, this is a cadaveric specimen. So here you have the gray matter on the surface and white matter lying more deeply. Then here you have the spinal cord. It's the link between the brain and the rest of the body and extends from the first cervical vertebra, from the lower part of the brain stem, to the first lumbar vertebrae in the adult. In a child, it may extend beyond that to about the third or fourth lumbar level. And again, the spinal cord is covered with the 3 layers of meninges: the pia mater, arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. So here, if you take the spinal cord, I told you that it extends only to the first lumbar vertebrae. If we take the different vertebrae, the spinal nerves emerge from in between the these vertebrae. Okay? So if you look at the spinal levels, shall I draw here? So you have the first cervical vertebrae here, the second, third, like that. You have, how many cervical vertebrae do you have?
7.
7.
7. Yes. Very good. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, and the spinal nerves emerge from between these vertebrae. The first cervical spinal nerve comes from above the first one. This is the first cervical nerve, spinal nerve. Then you have the second coming from above the second one, the third one coming from above the third, and then up to the seventh one, you have the cervical nerves coming from above the relevant vertebrae. This is the seventh, and you have a 8th cervical nerve as well. It comes from below the seventh one. Then you have the first thoracic vertebrae, and from then on, you have the nerves coming from below the relevant vertebral level. So this is the first thoracic nerve coming from below the first thoracic vertebrae. And like that, you have the nerves coming from below. And so the spinal cord inside the first lumbar level. Right? So below that, also you have nerves emerging from below this level. You don't have the spinal cord, you only have the spinal nerves extending. So this part is called the coda equina and contains only the spinal nerves. Equina means horse and coda means tail. Right? So it looks like a horse's tail. So that's why it's called the coda equina. And in this area, the pia mater ends here, and the dura mater and the arachnoid mater extends a bit further, right, up to the coccygeal level. And within the dura mater, within the subarachnoid space, you have CSF, and you can obtain CSF by inserting a needle through these layers. So you don't damage the spinal cord if you insert a needle below the L1 level. So that's what I wanted to tell you. Then here we have the cross section of a spinal cord. So in the anterior part, when you take the cross section, you have the gray matter in a edge-shaped structure like this, and surrounding it you have the white matter. So this gray matter is divided into horns. You have the dorsal horn, you have the lateral horn, and you have the ventral horn. So in this ventral horn or the anterior horn, you have a cell body of the motor nerves. These motor nerves supply the skeletal muscles. So here you have the motor nerves, and on the lateral horns you have autonomic nerves, the cell bodies of the autonomic nerves. And here in the dorsal horn you have cell bodies of the sensory nerves, actually the second order sensory nerves. So if you feel a sensation from the skin here, this is the first nerve that feels it, right? So from this dendrite, it takes in the information, and here in the posterior root. So these are the roots, the dorsal or the posterior root and the anterior or the ventral root. In the dorsal root, you have small swelling called the dorsal root ganglion. Here you have the cell body of the first nerve. It gives off the axon to the dorsal horn like this. And from here, you have the second neuron which takes the information to the central, to the brain. Okay. So from here. And here you have the motor neuron which gives information to the skeletal muscle. So in these areas, you have nerve fibers which travel from the brain and to the brain. Right? So these nerves, their fibers travel in these areas. Right. Here you can see them. These are given different names, right? The posterior white column, the lateral white column, and the anterior white column. You will learn about the different fibers traveling in each of these areas in your neuroanatomy module. Then if you look at the spinal reflex, I think you already know about this spinal reflex. It's a response to a stimulus, and it happens at a spinal level. The stimuli doesn't reach the brain, but it creates a response from the body. For example, if you accidentally hold a very hot cup of water, you will suddenly let go without thinking about it. It happens at a spinal level. So here you have the receptors at the skin, which will detect the cup of water, and it will give information to the spinal cord. Here, the posterior or the ventral horn. Here you have an interneuron, which gives the information to the motor neuron at the same spinal level. And this nerve gives the information to the muscles of the arm and withdraws the hand from the hot cup of water. Now, if you look at the peripheral nervous system, it again consists of cell bodies and nerve fibers. The cell bodies are found together as ganglia, and the nerve fibers, you have the axons as nerves. From the brain and the brainstem, you have cranial nerves. You have 12 pairs which leave the brain and pass through different holes in the skull, which are called foramina. Then from the spinal cord, as we discussed, you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And these pass from the within the vertebrae to the outside of the vertebrae through the intervertebral foramina. Then you also have the sympathetic chain and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. So if you look at the cranial nerves, you have 12 of the cranial nerves. You will learn about this in the neuroanatomy module. And here, if you look at the brain, there are small holes called foramina. And these nerves leave the brain from these spaces. Then you have the spinal nerve. As I said, so you have the intervertebral foramen between the vertebrae like this, and through these spaces, the vertebrae, the spinal nerves leave the spinal cord. Here you have the cervical nerve. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, but you have 8 cervical nerves, as I said earlier. So one leaves from above the first, and the last leaves below. And after that, you have the same number of the spinal nerves as the vertebrae. So you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 lumbar nerves. We have 5 sacral vertebrae, vertebral parts, and you have 5 circular nerves. But in the coccygeal part, you have 4 fused coccygeal vertebrae, but you have only 1 coccygeal nerve. In this picture also, you can see how the spinal nerves are distributed within the body. So if you look again at the cross-section of the spinal nerve, here you have the sensory nerves, the motor nerves, and here you have the autonomic nerves. The cell bodies are found in the lateral horn. If you look at how the body wall is innervated, these spinal nerves okay, so you have the roots coming out from the spinal cord. These roots get together and form the spinal nerves. This part is the spinal nerve, and again this divide into branches, the dorsal rami and the ventral ramus, or the posterior ramus or and the anterior ramus. Ramus means branch. So you have a posterior branch and the anterior branch. Okay, so when you look at how the body wall is innervated, these posterior rami supply the skin of the posterior, the back area, and the muscles of the surrounding the vertebrae in the posterior aspect. And you have the ventral or the anterior ramus coming forward around the body. Like this, you have them coming around the body and supplying the skin in a segmental manner like this. So, these supply the skin and the muscles found in the body wall in segments like this. So here you have a the mark, and you can identify the levels of the spinal nerve. So if you you can check the function of the spinal nerve by assessing the sensation of these parts, right? So you can check the if you check the sensation of this part of the patient and if they don't feel anything, you can assume. Okay, so you can assume that this patient has a problem in the T10 spinal level. So that's the importance of knowing the body wall innervation and the different levels that supply it. So these nerves travel in the neurovascular plane. This is the plane or the section within which the nerves travel within the body wall. So here you have the spinal nerve coming out. You have the dorsal ramus and the anterior ramus. And this neurovascular plane usually is found within the middle and the innermost layer of the body wall muscles. So if you take the thorax, you have 3 layers of muscle, and also in the abdomen you have 3 layers of muscles like this: the most external layer, an internal layer, and an innermost layer. So you have these nerves traveling within this internal layer and the innermost layer. And if we talk about the limb plexuses, these anterior nerves, they get together and form a network. They form nets in the upper limb. In this area, you have the brachial plexus. And in the pelvic area, you have the lumbar plexus. These form a network. So the brachial plexus is formed from C5 nerve root to T1 nerve root. So the anterior rami get together and form a network and give off nerves to supply the upper arm. The upper limb. So here you have the nerve supplying the pelvic area and the lower limb. This is formed from L4 to S4, this area. And then, as we discussed before, these spinal nerves supply the skin at different layers segmentally. So these areas are called dermatomes. An area supplied by a single spinal nerve is called the dermatome. And there are few overlapping areas. So usually if one dermatome is lost, it may be supplied by the adjacent close by other spinal nerves. Then myotones, similarly, the spinal nerves have muscles which are supplied segmentally like this. But the muscles usually have 2 to 4 nerve levels supplying one muscle. Like this. So this muscle of the thigh, it's supplied by both L3 and L4. Like that, you have several spinal segments supplying one muscle. Then we come to the autonomic nervous system. This innervates the involuntary structures, the heart, the smooth muscles, and the glands. As I said, it has a sympathetic component and the parasympathetic component. So if we look at the then in the spinal cord again, the brainstem, the spinal cord. From the you have the cervical area, thoracic, lumbar, and the sacral area. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and the spinal area. From these thoracic and lumbar areas, you have the sympathetic nerves coming out. And these sympathetic nerves are responsible for flight and fight reactions. And the parasympathetic part, it comes from the cranial, the brainstem areas. The cranium means the skull. Right? So from the brainstem, originating within the cranium, you have the parasympathetic nerves, and also from the sacrum. The first sacral parts, you have parasympathetic nerves coming out. So if you again look at the cross section of the spinal cord, here you have the cell body of the sympathetic nerve. It comes out through the anterior ramus, and then on either side of the spinal cord, on the either side of the vertebrae, you have two chains like this. So this is the this is one part of the chain. So these sympathetic nerves enter this chain, the sympathetic chain. And here it can either leave the spinal cord from here, or it can travel upwards or downwards. And it can also re-enter the spinal nerve and travel with other nerves from the spinal nerve. Okay, yes. So on either side, you have the sympathetic chain. Like this, and these extend beyond this thoracolumbar region, the sacral region and the cervical region. And so usually you have the sympathetic nerves entering this sympathetic chain, and here you have the second neuron starting. So here you have the cell bodies again. You can have cell bodies, and from these cell bodies you have the second neuron starting, which supplies the relevant organs. So if you take, for example, the heart, these nerves we supply the heart, and if you are running on something, it will activate the sympathetic system and increase the heart rate. And if you take the parasympathetic nerves, they usually go The first nerve, they have the cell bodies in the brainstem, and they travel close to the organ which they are supplying. For example, if you take a salivary gland, this is the first. You will have the salivary gland like this. So it goes very close to this gland, and then you have a small ganglia close to the organ which supply the gland like this. So when you take the sympathetic nerves, you have the ganglia closer to the vertebral column, and in the parasympathetic system you have the ganglia closer to the organ. Okay, so about the actions of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerves, I'm not going to tell you. You might already know your stuff. You can create a table and list down all the functions of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Right? So here you can mention the organ, the parasympathetic effect, and the sympathetic effect. And also, I have also given another activity to read on these areas, and you can create short notes. So these are the references I have used, and you can read up more on these areas in these books. So you don't have to read all these books, just find out what works for you. So some prefer to read the last, some prefer to read the snails. So the recommended book is the snails, but it's not set in that way. You can use what works for you. Okay, so thank you.